Hello.
Hello. Welcome to Honeydew Me podcast. I'm Cass.
And I'm Emma. And this is our podcast where we hang out and chit chat about our sex lives or your sex lives, relationships, friendships, feelings, and things that we're interested in the moment. Topical.
Topical. We're topical.
Yeah.
That makes it sound like an ointment.
I know. Topical ointments scare me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know why.
I think of
Anyway.
for crabs. I've never had crabs, but why do they call them crabs?
I don't know. I've always wondered that myself.
But to be honest, I do like that term a little bit better than pubic lice.
Correct. I would rather say I have crabs than pubic lice.
Maybe that's why they say it.
Wow, what a turn we took.
We're actually not talking about crabs this week.
No.
We're talking about pleasure. And we've talked about pleasure many a times before, but this time feels a little different. Hits a little different. We're talking about how to prioritize pleasure and really the why behind prioritizing pleasure. Not just to get the orgasm, but like what it does for your brain and how it can help you achieve whatever your goal is for your life. If you want to be happier, you want to have more fun, you want to be more relaxed, whatever it is. Our guest talks about how to use pleasure to help yourself get there.
Yeah. And I think like we went in with this idea of pleasure being very physical and very like a time you set aside to touch yourself or have your partner touch yourself. And it was just so much more expansive than that. And it was more from like the outside in and slowing down that I super appreciated because it can apply to, of course, your sex life, but also just enjoying your real life and being more present in your current day-to-day life and in being happy. So I thought that was really fun and like a very inspiring message from this episode.
I agree.
So today we are talking with Danielle Savory, a pleasure cloak. A pleasure cloak.
Just a cloak of pleasure.
I mean, it was a pleasure coach. And I'm just so thankful that she has come into our orbit of conversation with sex and relationships. I'm like, it was awesome. Mind blowing.
It was. It really was. So we'll leave the rest to her and we will see you at the end of the episode.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Yeah, so my name is Danielle Savory. I am a sex and pleasure coach, and I mostly work with those that are socialized as women, but I leave it open for most all individuals. And really what I like to focus on with these clients is looking or using sex kind of as a lens for us to get to the next level of personal growth in a lot of different areas. So my background's neuroscience. I geek out on the brain. And so really just like touching into all the ways that we can benefit our brain through what comes up when we take a look at our relationship with pleasure and sexuality.
That's amazing. I wish I had a background in neuroscience. That would be so much cooler.
I mean, it's kind of cool, but I mean, it was most of the stuff I feel like I've learned about neuroscience happened way after I graduated when you're actually involved in learning versus memorization. So,
yeah, true. Well, we love talking about how everything is all connected and how our pleasure and our like sexuality and sexual experiences all leak into our relationships and how we just move in the world. So I love that you're here to talk with us today because we want to talk about pleasure and we need help and some coaching around pleasure. As busy women, where the hell do we find time to prioritize that in our life? Like, how do we keep it as a main priority when we just have so many other things to do in our lives?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question, and it really goes to every individual. And the thing that's helped the most for me with having this like very full life is deciding why it matters and understanding that our why can change in seasons of our life. Our why might change from day to day, from month to month, but really finding a why that motivates you is going to help you prioritize it. Because most of us, we look at pleasure and we don't really understand how it could benefit us, or it feels like it's like more for my partner, or it feels like a lot of effort. You know, like when we talk about really feeling motivated or going after something, it's like that. Is the outcome of pleasure equal to the effort I have to put into it to get the pleasure, right? So that's like
Mhm.
typically when you hear people and psychologists talk about like us being motivated, so much of motivation and activation comes from just that subconscious awareness of like, is the reward worth the effort? And so I think that there can be more emphasis for us, especially those of us socialized as women, to like really understand, how can pleasure benefit us? How could that improve my life? Like, what is that reward outside of just that immediate reward? Because if we're talking about sexual pleasure, like obviously a good orgasm is awesome all
Mhm.
the time, anytime, but it doesn't always feel like that end or that result is worth the effort to get there, whether it's just, doing, finishing your to-do list, like getting in the mood, relaxing, like whatever it might be. And so I think the first thing that we really need to take a look at is our relationship with pleasure and what we look at pleasure, because pleasure, for most of us, it's like kind of a dirty word. It can be this dirty word when it comes to sex. It can be this dirty word when it comes to like, oh, my guilty pleasure is watching like Real Housewives or whatever. Like we always have pleasure in this special bucket, but it's like off limits, or it's a reward, or nice to have, or luxury. And really switching our mindset to like, no, this is actually vital. This is for my overall well-being. It's for my overall health. But even more importantly, it's just to help me enjoy life more, which is what I hope all of us want when we're thinking about like making choices and actions and behaviors.
Mhm.
That's such an interesting way to think about it. Like that's a
Mhm.
big reframe for me. Sorry,
Yeah.
Emma, I cut you off.
No,
Yeah.
you're fine. But like saying it's in a different bucket, and absolutely correct with like guilty pleasure and pleasure being more of like a reward that you get at the end of your to-do list. It does feel like something that, we get as a present if we were good, or if we
Yeah.
do it and we neglected a different task, it's like we've done something bad. And then we're associating our pleasure and time that we spend with ourselves and on ourselves with like what was I where was I even just going? But like how we neglected something else to spend time on ourselves, but therefore we didn't finish our task or our to-do list. And so now
Yes.
it's like a bad thing that we did that because we kind of got distracted and we shouldn't have been spending that time there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then,
Mhm.
being immersed in this culture that really emphasizes production, like what are we
Mhm.
producing? What are we achieving? What are we, our self-worth is so tied into that. It makes a lot of sense why, we think, oh, I'm a busy woman, right? Have a busy life. And that takes the bulk versus saying, I'm a very satisfied woman. I'm a very pleasured woman. Like I'm
Mm.
enjoying my life. Like even the way that we self-identify with this oftentimes is going to keep leaving pleasure in that realm of the like special or the nice to have versus like this is part, like I'm a healthy person, like I'm a pleasured woman. This is part of my overall well-being and really part of my self-identification that I'm aiming for.
Saying I'm a satisfied woman, I feel like Beyonce. Like, are you kidding me? That like wraps up feeling like the satisfaction I feel like people can have by saying I'm a busy person. For me gives me a feeling of purpose. Like I'm important. I'm a busy person. I contribute to the world in society. But saying I'm a satisfied person, I'm a happy, I'm like a pleased person. It's like, yeah, I'm booked and busy, but also like I'm happy. And I like that
Yeah.
was good.
Yeah. I mean, how many of us say that, right? And I
Mhm.
do feel like it's not just us. It's really going to take a cultural shift of like how we view success, like whether
Yeah.
we're viewing success in this way of like our achievements or how busy we're doing or how much we're volunteering at our kids' school or how much we're involved in like activism or whatever it might be, right? Like we have these standards and it's okay to spend your time doing those. That's something that society has really encouraged us to do. And when we start to reframe it of like, are you satisfied? Are you happy? Are you feeling connected to the people in your life? Are you present? And we start to redefine success as those things, that it's less about those to-do lists and did I get done with my to-do list, but like how satisfied do I feel at the end of the day? And some of that satisfaction might come in achievement, but realizing it's so much more of that and realizing how much of the way that we've been socialized is really driving that behavior and that motivation to begin with.
I really liked what you were saying this entire time. But in the beginning, you were talking about how like we don't understand the reward of pleasure. Like we understand, oh, I'm going to get an orgasm, but not the bigger part
why
of it, the why. So can you kind of redefine pleasure for us and help us understand why it is so important that we actually prioritize it?
That's crazy, Cass. That was such a mind meld. I was like about to ask that too. So thank you for wrapping back around.
This is where we're supposed to go.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I nerd out on the brain, but this was something that I really had to kind of do my own research in to find out reasons that resonated with me, right? Like, what are the things that are really important to me? And one of the things is like personal growth. Like, I love personal growth. I think it's cool for us to find out what we're capable of, what our body's capable of, what potential we have, like how much can I like learn and grow and change and all of those sorts of things. And so when I started taking a look at motivation and what helps us become motivated individuals to create change, and specifically looking at like the role the amygdala plays, because like I love the amygdala. I don't really know why. I think it was just because it was the first brain structure I had to find, and it was really hard to find. So when I found it, I was like, killing it. And so I just think it's like just this cute little almond shaped part, and it plays such an important role with our stress and with our motivation. And like, well, if I don't want my amygdala to be like really big and like super sensitive, so I could use it more for like motivation and seeing how pleasure really allows for that. Like when we really take a look at what pleasure does, and when I'm redefining pleasure, it's a delight, it's an awe, it's a satisfaction. But the difference, I think, versus pursuing happiness or pursuing joy or something like that, these are great things, like pursue joy for sure. But the reason I like to really think about pursuing pleasure is because there is an element of a body awareness. Like we can say I'm super happy and you have no idea what's going on in your body. You're like, that makes me happy, or like I feel really joyful. But you can't really say I'm really pleasured or I'm experiencing a lot of pleasure unless you drop your attention into your body, unless you have some sort of awareness about not just like an emotional experience that is positive, but also a sensory experience that is also positive. So that combination of our awareness being in our bodies linked to positive emotional experiences, being in that landscape completely changes your brain structure. Now we're starting to wire for motivation. We're starting to wire for deeper intimacy and connection. We're starting to rewire our brain for focus, like all these qualities, self-compassion, like all these qualities that we say that we really want. When we start with pleasure and how can I experience more pleasure in my day, or in this pleasure in this activity I'm doing, or seeing where I'm blocking myself from pleasure, especially during sexual experiences, we unlock our brain to really optimize it in all of these different ways. And, there's also just studies about immune system. It helps your immune system. It helps your heart. It helps your longevity. I mean, the list could go on and on, like how long do we have? But it's really like, what is it that you want? And how can we see that pleasure really plays a role in you getting that quality, that trait, or that outcome that you're really seeking?
My mind is like going a million miles an hour. When you said prioritizing pleasure over like obviously yes, pursue joy and happiness, but pursuing pleasure, I immediately felt what pleasure could feel like in the body. Whereas happiness, it feels like such an overused term and such something that I've like, am I happy right now? Like I think I'm not sad, so I think I'm happy. And then being confused and still doing activities that like you don't quite know how you feel. But pleasure, that does feel so much more sensory and so much more sensory and tangible, that like, oh, if I pursue pleasure, that kind of completely changes the game.
Yeah. And the thing I love about pleasure, like I love that you brought that up, because I didn't mean to tie it just to positive emotions. Like the beautiful thing about pleasure is we can experience pleasure alongside the challenging times. We can experience
Mm.
pleasure right alongside sadness. And oftentimes when we realize that there's, more than one thing going on, like I can be sad, I can be in grief, I can be like in just hormonal stew of all of the emotions. And I could have a soft blanket like wrapped around me. And that pleasure of that soft blanket or that nourishing cup of tea, that pleasure of that experience is going to help that challenging thing that I'm going through have a little bit softer edges. It allows us to really be with the hard times in such a way that we're not disconnecting from the body, but we can process our emotions. And we just don't think of pleasure like that or pursuing it in this way. But when we realize it can really exist in any given moment and we can use it as a tool to allow us to not just become more resilient, but move through the hard, like a balm, like when you have a sore throat and your grandmother tells you to have some honey, right? It's like, it's not to ignore the sore throat, but like, let's soothe it a little bit. Like, let's make this sore throat a bit more easy. And we can do that with our whole host of human emotions, especially when we insert the element of pleasure.
It's so sweet. And so, I don't even know. Like, this is such a reframe, as I was saying, and I love it so much. And I'm wondering, like, how do we figure out what's pleasurable? Because it feels like in order to, use it in these more complicated situations or, access it when we are feeling joy, it's like we need to know what feels good. So is that just trial and error? Do you have some suggestions of where we can start?
Yeah, I think the start is knowing that I can capture my attention at any given time. And usually, if we're going through a challenging or a painful experience, by default, our brain really wants to highlight that. Like if it's a physical discomfort in your body, which emotional experiences are also physically just like uncomfortable, but your brain wants to like highlight it, like get rid of this. I got to get rid of this. This isn't good. And when we can find pleasure, we can actually stay with that emotion. And so my whole journey with this was because I was had chronic pain issues in my body and I was bedridden for the better part of 2 years. And during this time was like really when I started to realize like, okay, like I'm hurting so bad right here, but this part of my body doesn't hurt. Or I'm hurting so bad right here, but like that smell of the lavender I just sprayed is like gorgeous. Or I can look out my window and I could see the green and I could just experience like, oh, but that's beautiful, or that smells so delightful, or that feels really good. Like there was areas I could start to find in my body and turn towards the good on purpose. Like really notice my brain is always going to go here, but I can also be like, oh yes, my love, like that is painful, that hurts. And also look at this delight that we have over here. Like look at this moment or this taste, or like my husband's smile or like his laughter. Like we also have that. And so I think it's just trial and error. Like what is lighting me up? Like looking around the room, like what color do I love in here? What is something I love to smell, and just smelling around your room, like in any given moment, feeling things and like, oh, that feels nice. Like I love that. And then you start to kind of create this list in the head of some of the things, and of course, with understanding our body and sexual experiences, we can have so much more curiosity with those as well. But starting just to create your list and knowing that that might change, like when I'm annoyed, like my husband's laugh is not pleasurable. Like I'm like, shut up. Right?
This does not bring me
So it's
pleasure.
also like the context of like that we're experiencing that sound or that, touch or that smell. Like it's like if you're nauseous, like something that really lights you up as a smell might make you want to vomit at a different time. And so being flexible to be like, I like that sometimes, but I'm not into that at all right now.
I love the flexibility because I do feel like it can change. And Cass and I know that up and down about things that'll annoy the shit out of us one moment and then not so much the next moment when it
Yeah.
comes to partners. But I as much as this practice is so beautiful and I love how accessible it is at any given moment, it doesn't have to
Mhm.
just be sexual. Um, Neurologically, does this take practice to rewire and like incorporate this type of reframe or redirect in your mental process so that like these challenging moments you can find a pleasurable thought or a pleasurable sensation? Because I feel like I could get down on myself with having gone through maybe a hard moment or a hard day and be like, that was a really missed opportunity for
Yeah.
me to have found like some pleasure out of that or some like
Mm-hmm.
silver lining. So does it still take practice for that to come a little bit naturally?
Yeah, and I would say I don't know if it ever necessarily comes naturally, but it does
Mm-hmm.
become easier. It does become what I would say is more practiced because naturally our response is going to be protection and,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times negativity bias. We're working with that. We're highlighting these sorts of things, what's painful, what's uncomfortable, because your brain's constantly scanning for threats. And so yes, it is a beautiful practice and it is a practice. Like it
Mm-hmm.
takes practice. And the thing that is cool though is like the more that you do it, the more that you remind yourself or you see an opportunity, then it does actually start changing the structure of your brain. So it becomes more accessible to you over time, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning or like this was not accessible to me at all. It was like I literally had to try and remember over and over and over again for a long time, and it would take being immersed in pain and being like, oh yeah, I could also notice. And I want to be clear here, it's not necessarily turning to a silver lining, because we're not ignoring the other stuff. We're not pretending that doesn't exist. We're realizing we're a container that can hold more than one thing. More than one thing can be true. And that allows us to not disconnect from the hard, not be all Pollyanna and pretend everything is like shiny, but like this moment is really hard. And also this moment could have some delight in it, or it could have some like sensual experience that I'm really enjoying. Like it can be more than one. And so I think that is a really important thing to remember. And as you're going through the practice, having compassion, like, oh, it's not like I miss this opportunity. I was like, oh, okay, there was an opportunity. Huh. I'm so glad I'm aware of that. Maybe I'll watch out for that next time. Like really being on your own side, even during the process of practicing and pursuing pleasure, understanding that by default and the way that we're all wired as human beings, you're not meant to see it. You're not going to see it right away. And sometimes it's, I've been doing this kind of stuff now for almost 20 years and I still, like, oh, yeah, that would have been a good time. And
Mm-hmm.
next time I can remember, so it's just continuously being open to learning and adjusting.
Mm-hmm.
So how does sex incorporate into all of this? Like, is sexual pleasure different? Is it the same? Is it like extra special?
Yeah, well, I think it's extra special because it involves so much more, right? Involvement, and so many more parts of our brain are activated. If it's partnered sex, you have somebody else that you're working with. And in order for us to experience and really surrender to a lot of pleasure that our body is wired for, there is healing that usually needs to happen. There are other things that, especially those socialized as women, really have to go through to kind of be okay with pleasure. Like, see that this is for me, feeling safe, being vulnerable, creating safety around sex in general, giving ourselves permission to ask for what we want, being brave enough to even ask ourselves, what do you want, and learn about our desires. So there is so many other elements that come into sex, why I really feel like it's the epitome, right? It's the epitome of like our pleasurable experience. When we look at what are the nerves that can give us the most pleasure, like, hello, between your legs is like a straight shot to that, right?
A pretty good start. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the epitome of pleasure. But I also think it's like what we were saying here at the beginning of the podcast, what you both see, right? Is like how it impacts everything else. And so much of the way that we see ourselves or see in the world, or relationship to pleasure, or our experience with boundaries. I mean, you name it, it's like it's highlighted in the sexual experience. And so when we can actually start by looking at the sexual experience, you get to increase your own self-awareness way quicker than if you were going through like personal growth and just being like, where do I need to be more self-compassionate? It's like, oh, how have I been treating myself today? Like, I noticed my body's totally shut down and I had a sexy, session scheduled. I'm not available at all for that. I wonder why. Did I have some boundaries crossed? Did I, did I not speak to my desires? Was I being down on myself and being unkind to myself? All these things that really don't help us create a hospitable environment for pleasure or sexual connection, we can see them really clearly. So yes, from a growth standpoint, sex can be like this pinnacle, but also this compass that we can see more clearly some other behaviors and habits that might be keeping us from pleasure. And just from neurochemicals that are released in our brain, oxygenating our brain. I mean, orgasms are like more oxygenation to our brain than any other thing we can do as human beings. All the areas it turns on, the creativity that lights up. I mean, there's so much that happens with that heightened arousal and climax and orgasmic state.
I'm wondering about when, you can identify, like you're like, yes, this is really getting in the way, but it's not really something you can remove, or you're not sure how to work through it. Like, if you're on antidepressants and it's really hard to orgasm and you aren't really turned on most of the time, or if you're postpartum and everything feels different, like how do you use those as like a compass when it's not really something you can just like set to the side, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And, I think that we have to see, what am I available for now? Like, what is like not like my potential for pleasure for somebody else, right? But what is my potential for pleasure? And really giving ourselves permission to be like, that's going to look different at like different points in our life, different time periods that we're going through. And so many studies show that as we're also like, let's take antidepressants for instance, right? We have that, and that is something that's going to change our neurochemistry. But there's also other practices we can do to also support our neurochemistry. And so that's where we have to get our brain on board. Like, it's worth the effort, of whether it's mindfulness or pleasure practices, or like grounding practices, different types of somatic practices. Like, it's worth it, and this is a season right now where I have to put a little bit more effort into this because my neurochemistry is a little bit shifted. And, I've had to do that multiple times, not just with my own emotional journey, but like postpartum, my own neurodivergence, and just understanding and having compassion that my experience and level of pleasure might look different, but pleasure is still possible. And I wonder how much I can experience. I wonder what's available for me today when I put my effort and intention towards it.
So is this when our why would come in? Because I'm thinking of all of the topics that you and Cass just discussed, and it's like, obviously that would be great things to work on, but then if you incorporate this busy person schedule and you're like, great, I have no time, why would I try to focus on that? Why would I put effort into my pleasure? I feel like that would be like a really hard thing to remember. So is this when we would bring back in our why as someone who's super busy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, again, if you're not interested, don't. right? I think
Yeah.
first and foremost, it's like, I'm not pushing pleasure on anybody. Like that's the last thing that we're trying to do here, right? But if it's like, if there's a why that resonates with you, then we have to tap into that. And we have to remember too, a lot of times if we are busy, we're likely dealing with some sort of stress cycle, some level of stress in our life. And when we're there, we're in that place, we're not going to automatically remember the things that are like, oh, I want to be a really happy person, or I want to be really satisfied, or I want to be whatever. Like you actually don't have access to that part of your brain during this time. And so it's another reason for us to write it down. It takes continuous practice, like reminding myself what's important. This sounds very morbid, but I go to the dramatic, like, what do I want? Like if on my deathbed, what am I going to look back on and love that I made the effort for, or the connections I had, right? Coming back to these kind of like larger meta sort of situations for yourself to become motivating, but it has to really resonate with you, and giving yourself permission that it might not feel as altruistic as maybe you want it to. Like when I was first a mom, and everything was triggering. Like it was really hard. I was not handling it how I thought. I was so overstimulated. And at the time, I didn't even know about my neurodivergence. All I knew was like, I don't like this. This is not great. This is not fun. And I would like pop off or get triggered. And I really wanted to find a reason. And it sounds great. Like, I don't want to be a crazy mom. Like, that could be one thing. Or I want to demonstrate for my daughters, like, something that a quality that they want, like a calm and collected mom. But like, that felt like a should. Like, that felt like another should to me. And I was like, why did I want to become a mom? I was like, I want to have fun. Like, I want to enjoy motherhood. So in those moments where I was like, and I was like, are you having fun? Like that little whisper. I was like, what is one thing you could do to like enjoy this a little bit more? And that just allowed my shoulders to soften. That allowed like me to get curious and open up, because I was like, I do want to have fun doing this. Like, I don't want to be a raging mom and super irritable and hangry every single dinner time. Like, I do want to have a good time. Telling myself I just want to be calm and collected because it's a really good, representation for your daughters growing up. Like, that was not motivating for me during that time. Of course, that's something I want. So again, finding a why for you. Like, what is the thing that actually is going to propel you enough into action to see things differently, and have a number of them, because that is going to change day to day, week to week, month to month, and all these different seasons that we have in our life.
Can we maybe pick a why and dive into it a little bit more on like how pleasure helps us become that, like neurologically? I love what you said about like having fun. I feel like that's something a lot of us could use. And I think we make a lot of our decisions because we want to be happy, we want to have fun. And then it's like, oh my God, this like, I'm not having fun. Like, what is going on? I feel like I'm bad at having fun. So I would like, that's something that I would love to learn about. But Emma, if you have another one, I'm open to a different why as well.
No, I completely agree, because I think I always want to have fun, and whenever I journal about like what I want in my future, is like, I just want to be happy. But also I think I'm bad at being present with those feelings, and then not remembering them in moments. So anyway, that's all to say, yes, let's choose that one.
Yes. I love this. I love this so much. So like the first thing to pay attention to is something that you just said there, Emma, about like, I feel like I do have these moments, but I'm not present for them. So you have all been doing this for a while, right? Like, how does presence play into pleasure, especially during sex?
It slows down my mind. I mean, I feel like I'm a planner. And so even in pleasure, and a performer, I feel like it
I'm a star.
Not in the way.
I was like, tell me more.
But more so in the like, I know that this is the sound I should be doing, and this is like the movement I should be making. And then I want this to go quicker. So how can I plan ahead? And it's more like I lose this presence and this sensation of what even's happening in front of me because I'm in my head.
Yeah. Yeah. So good, right? So by the pursuit of pleasure during our sexual interaction, right? It requires us to learn how to capture our attention. Like, oh, I have an agenda right now. Oh, I notice I'm performing. I'm worried more about somebody else's experience rather than mine. And you're training your brain to come back into focus and into a central focus of the good, the pleasure, right? And that is a skill set that can translate. Then when you're out about in the world, it's like you could experience, like hear or listen or be like, oh, I noticed I was thinking about when is this party going to get over? Or what is that person doing over here? Or how did I just come across when I was talking to that person? It's the same sorts of things. And this is a skill set. So skill sets translate. If you are working on focusing and pursuing pleasure, then you can start to see and use those same skill sets out in the world of like, how often am I paying attention to my to-do list or what I need to do afterwards, or how long is this thing taking? And could I be present for the good stuff, the happy stuff? Like, am I having fun right now? What could I do to have a little bit more fun? So you start to really increase your awareness, and pleasure is part of also having fun. So it goes hand in hand of like, how could I be having more fun right now? Like, what sounds good? Like, what sounds delightful? Like, we are creating a context to be able to then turn towards it. So not only is pleasure helping your presence, your focus, your capturing of your attention, noticing that you're wandering, but it's also helping, what is the word I'm looking for? Like embellish or kind of like juice up these happy moments, because you're going to start to notice like, ooh, like feel that music in my body. Like, oh, that's like lighting me up. It's filling me up. I'm having so fun. And you can immerse yourself more in those experiences.
So if you're able to experience, let's say during sex, you're like really able to be present and feel the full pleasure of it, does that make it so your brain is like more willing to look for it next time? Like it's just more geared towards really searching out the pleasure?
Yes and no. Number one, your brain becomes more sensitized to pleasure.
Okay.
So we have like a part of our brain called the insula, which like shows us how we're feeling, not shows us, but you know what I'm saying? It like allows us to like create and expand on our capacity to feel sensations in our body. So the more that we are doing that, the more that we can feel those type of sensations, like, oh, like when that person came around, I noticed I was really tightened. Or you could start to notice like your reaction to when a boundary is being crossed, like, so you can start to notice these kind of things. But we also train our brain to look for the good. You're training your brain to be like, okay, well, I could think about, what my body and why is that part jiggling? Like that never jiggled that like long ago. Like what is going on? Like, oh, love, like that's old socialization. Let's come back to like something else, right? Like I'm training my brain to notice and to come back to the good. And that is definitely a skill set. And the more we get used to looking for the good, you can't help but do it. It does become, I don't want to say you totally override our negativity bias, but you allow it to become less strong. And you still might have that first thought, like first thought, the negative thing, or first thought, the uncomfortable thing, first thought, I didn't really like this. But because you're training yourself being like, oh, that's a first thought, that's default, that's autopilot, that's a habit, whatever you might notice it as, you're like, and remember, what am I working on paying attention to? Like, what is delighting me? What is lighting me up? Like, what am I loving right now? How could I have more fun with this?
My mind is just blown by how vast pleasure is and how many parts of our lives it can cover. Because coming into this, I was thinking of only the physical, and I was thinking of pleasure being sanctioned to like a masturbation practice or an intimate like evening with your partner, and how we can embellish that time. But it didn't hit on all of these points that we're covering now of how pleasure can, it does start so much farther outside the bedroom, so that you're even present for what's happening when you're in those intimate moments, when you're having your masturbation practice. And it's just, we know things are connected, but I just didn't realize how connected this was, that it can literally start with how you said, like a blanket that you're like, oh, this is really nice feeling, even though I feel like shit right now, or my head hurts or something, but like this blanket's kind of nice, both and
Yes.
it's just so much bigger than I thought.
And it's so cool, I think, when we really start to look at it this way, is because we get to use these elements then to amplify our experience of pleasure in sexual situations. Like, it's not only is like what you're doing with pleasure during sex going to help you amplify pleasure outside or help you focus your attention towards pleasure, but it goes vice versa. It's like if you start to notice like the softness like really lights you up, you can bring that in to paying attention to that and bringing it into the whole experience of having sex or having a self pleasure session. Like, you get to start bringing in intentionally these other experiences of pleasure to help amp up and create, I don't want to say bigger orgasms, but like, for lack of a better word, like better orgasms, multi orgasms, like the kind of like mind blowing orgasms we hear so much of. What's really going on is we're creating this experience where we're so focused on different experience of pleasure, and then we can amplify it. We can spread it into different parts of our body. We can play with like the volume of it and really start to like, when we're talking about pleasure potential, like that's when we really start getting into some fun play when it comes to our pleasure.
Good Lord. It's just a reverse. Like you said, it's not the bedroom out, it's out in. And that like completely flipped, I feel like, how we initially approached this topic, right, Cass?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm wondering if we can get a little bit more into stress, and how that can get in the way of us experiencing pleasure. And I'm also wondering if, being less stressed is our why, how that incorporates into all of this too. Like, does experiencing more pleasure positively impact our levels of stress?
Yes, it does. But again, it's like, do we start with the chicken or the egg? It's outside in and it's inside out. So stress, we know, is not. It doesn't create. I always like to say it's like, this is such a nerdy term, but I love it, like a conducive environment for pleasure. So, or a container for pleasure. So when we're really trying to think of like a garden, like what is the most like nourishing type of thing that I could do for my garden so that my flowers bloom or my vegetables grow really big or whatever it might be, right? So it's like, is this environment conducive to pleasure? And the thing that we know about the nervous system is, when we're in a stress state, especially like fight or flight, then, and even freeze, your brain is already on hyper alert. It's already looking for things that can be possible threats. And we also know the way it kind of disconnects us from our prefrontal cortex. And so our rational thinking, I'm putting that in quotes because I know that can be a triggering thing for some of us, thinking like, you're not being rational right now. But we see things in red, so it's like, if you're already annoyed, if you're already triggered, then you're more likely to see more situations and more things as annoying. So for instance, if you're irritated, if you're in a stress cycle, and then your partner says something to you, that can be then tainted towards negativity. It's like painting it a totally different color versus when we're feeling really good and we're really happy and we feel like we did a lot today and we're, just in a great fun mood. Your partner literally could say the same thing, approach you in the same way, touch you in the same way. And you're like, oh my God, you're so cute. I love you. Let's get naked. And then the other time we're not. We're like, are you kidding me? Like, get the app away. Like, it feels like a threat to your body. It feels like a threat to your space, to your energy. And so stress, just by default has our brain scanning for threats, and an initiation is going to feel like a threat. A bun grab is going to feel like a threat. A joke that you would normally find funny is going to feel like a threat. And so understanding the way that we're consuming the things around us when we're in a stress cycle really kind of cuts us off from pleasure, from desire, from the connection that we really, really want. And and chronic stress, even worse. Chronic stress can have an impact on our hormones. It can have my favorite part of the brain, the amygdala. Like, that poor little guy gets so big and he gets so sensitive and his alarm bells just start going off for everything. And everything becomes more triggering more often, where when we learn to take care of our stress, not only do we become available for more pleasure and more desire, but once we experience it, that can help create more of these I just hate the word positive, but we're going to use it, positive emotional states in our brain. We really start to create more of those neural connections. And think about, coming back to the amygdala, like if it keeps getting triggered, keeps getting triggered, keeps getting triggered, keeps getting triggered, it becomes more sensitive and the little things will start triggering it more. If you're starting to experience more pleasure, it becomes like satiated. It calms down. It has this chance to be more established in like this balanced way. It becomes balanced. Your brain becomes balanced. So things aren't as irritating. Things are going to bounce off you. You might be triggered, but your bounce back time is going to be quicker. Your resilience becomes more. And so we want to help ourselves notice when we're in stress so that we can reduce the amount of stress. And then I'm now available for pleasure. So like I teach this tool just called Bridge to the Bedroom, right? Like, we want to say maybe because we don't know if we're stressed and we're being asked or we have it scheduled or we're thinking about it. Your brain's always going to say no. Like, it's a no. Like, I'm not into it, right? So we want to create a bridge to the bedroom so you can at least get a real answer from your body because you're not in a stress state. And then once we do pursue more pleasure and experience more pleasure, you are literally changing the structure of your brain to turn towards the good, to start seeing the good more in your life. Again, it's not to ignore real things, but it does help us not get caught up in old narratives. It does help us not embellish stories that don't need to be embellished. It helps us actually process clean pain rather than getting into that whole game of dirty pain with us adding our narrative onto every single thing that happens that really creates that suffering and discontent in our life.
I feel like I could talk to you about stress and anxiety and get a completely like revolutionized view. Like you're saying clean pain and dirty pain. Like I would love to dive into those things some other time because that just sounds so fascinating. But also like while I don't totally know what you mean, I can also understand it completely about like how stress can muddy those senses of like what is my body actually feeling. And is the way through like a stressful or a stress heightened moment where you do want to feel pleasure and you want to settle in, like how are we dropping down through that in a moment so that we can be like, okay, I know I want an orgasm right now. Can I just set aside 10 minutes for myself to like feel pleasure? Like how do we kind of bring that down, or if we can like set stress aside right next to us for a moment?
Yeah. Well, first I would say let's give ourselves more than 10 minutes to experience pleasure because what? We have 24
Fair.
hours in a day. I'm feeling all the stress and all of this angst in my body, but let me have some enjoyment for 10 minutes only. Then you're cut off.
Cut
Um,
off.
but maybe that's what we need at the beginning, right? Like, honestly, like when
Mhm.
we're in that state, we're like, I don't have time for anything, but it's like 10 minutes can feel like a lot. So
Mhm.
not trying to get tongue in cheek, but so I would say it depends on like what's going on with our stress, and how we get out of it. So obviously there's like mindfulness techniques, there's deep breathing techniques, there's somatic things, there's grounding things. And I think it's really important for us to know, like, is it feeling like energy needs to escape my body? Like there's different types of stress that we feel different things. Like if I'm feeling so worried and it's like Sunday night and I have like a million things going on this week and my brain is going a million miles an hour, it's really helpful for me to just brain dump and just get it all out of my head first. Like that is the best thing for me during those moments, is just to get it all out and then put my hand on my heart and go, oh, my love, okay, now we can drop in. Now we can be present. Like you can look at all those things tomorrow. Let's take some deep breaths. And then I can go into more of a grounding practice. But if my mind's on like hyper like alert about all of those things, it just doesn't, a lot of people are like, just take deep breaths. For me, that's not always accessible. And even if I do, it doesn't do anything for my mind. And so we have to remember that there can be a whole menu of things that we're choosing from to help us get out of this. And that's part of understanding your body. Like if I'm really angry, and this is in general, like usually if you're angry, you'll notice a lot of like experience like sensations in your arms and your upper body, because our nervous system triggered our arms to like go fight. And so if you're experiencing a lot of anger, like it helps me like feeling like I'm throwing that anger like out of my fingers like fireballs. And I actually picture like the people or the things I want to throw fireballs at, but like whatever, right? Like you're like, and you feel like you're like throwing it out. You hear about people like punching pillows, but like punching pillows isn't going to help if you're, in a frozen state. I mean, maybe it will, but looking at like, what is the thing that I'm really stressed about? And what is the thing that's going to help me complete that stress cycle? If I'm really afraid, then a lot of times what we do is we run away, right? So move your legs, dance, like kind of like you're mimicking running away, and then breathe deep, then, stimulate that vagus nerve. Another one for me is shaking. Like if I feel frozen, if I feel stuck, if I feel like this like stress that's keeping me hidden, then I need to shake or dance or like get some joy back, like make my mouth smile. So I think there's a number of different things that we can do, but really starting to be curious of like, what kind of stress does this feel like? Because it's different for all of us, and being able to meet your own need during that time.
I love all the examples you gave us.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing
Holy
that.
shit.
Yeah.
I'm going to use those fireballs.
Oh, they're
That
so
sounds
good,
fantastic.
especially with your imagination. You're
So
like,
good. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. And bringing your awareness, like you're saying, like tying in all of this talk about pleasure and in the different ways that we can experience pleasure throughout our day, and then bringing that towards our stress and being able to realize in what ways it's sitting in our body and how can I complete that cycle. That was such a beautiful way to describe stress as more than just like something I have to sit with now because it's here now. And it's like, no, but this can be a cycle if you want it to be, where we can complete it and then hopefully try to move on with our day a little bit more.
yeah.
I
And
love thinking.
understanding if we don't complete it, guess what? It just compounds the next day. Now you're on a simmer. Now you're just like in this like like cycle of perpetuity, and so understanding that closing the cycle, whether or not you're pursuing an orgasm that night, is just helpful for us to, just really support our amygdala, because he's just such a little great
Amygdala.
friend.
Yeah.
Like, sorry, guy, you just really need a hug right now. I can see you're just like big and like bloated. Let me help you out.
Let me help you out. Can it shrink and expand?
Yeah.
With
Well, it doesn't shrink and expand, but it does grow, like actually grow in size. But it's not, I like to visualize it doing that. It doesn't actually, it takes a lot of time for it to start to create like gray matter, but it can change in size. Yeah.
We have learned so much today, but from like the inside out in multiple ways. That's insane. Is there anything we didn't cover in regards to pleasure that we want to touch on before we wrap up?
Or are you asking me?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I'm asking you that we didn't ask you yet.
I mean, we could talk about, like you said, we could talk about this, till the cows come home. There's so many things to talk about. But I think the main thing that I would say for anyone listening to this is I hope that you took a couple things away that are at least piquing your interest or your curiosity, why pleasure is a worthy pursuit. And asking yourself, like, if I were to pursue pleasure, perhaps like, what is possible for me, or what is the kind of person that I really want to be, and how could pleasure play into that role? And really starting to see that pleasure can be like, we can start our day with pleasure being the priority. Like, you can look at your list and know that you're going to uptick every single thing on your list with a little bit of pleasure. But when we start to flip the entire script, everything we also want to accomplish, including the person that we want to be, is going to be more accessible and more easily achieved when we start by prioritizing our pleasure.
I love it. What a closer.
Yeah, fuck. You're good at that.
Where can our listeners continue connecting with you after this episode?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram supposedly, but I am not been good about that lately. But I have all the intention to be on there more, and that is at The Practice of Pleasure. And I have a podcast called It's My Pleasure, when we dive into obviously all topics pleasure related. And my website is daniellesavory.com. And if you want to start your morning with more pleasure and learn how to not add anything to your morning routine, but just infuse it with pleasure, I have this great guide called the Savory Starter Guide. So it's daniellesavory.com/savory starter. So you'll be able to get into your own pleasure practices.
I like ranted and raved to Cass for probably 15 minutes after this episode about how much my mind was blown. And then I sent my number to Danielle so that she and I could hang out. Like, all of these things happened because of how much I loved this episode, and how much I want to use it every day and sexually.
And
so
sexually.
And absolutely sexually.
Abso-fucking-lutely. So thank you so much to Danielle, and to our listeners. You can head on over to Apple Podcasts to rate, review, and subscribe to Honeydew Me. You can leave us a written review, rate us on Spotify, watch us on YouTube. If you ever have an episode suggestion or a question that you would like a guest to answer, you can head on over to the link in our bios on social media and submit it there. You can also write us at honeydewmepodcast@gmail.com. And we can answer those questions in our solo episodes, unless it is an unsolicited dick pic, in which case you'll want to go back a couple of episodes and hear what is actually wrong with your brain, and why you're sending that.
You'll want to take a few steps back in your life, hit rewind, and just not do it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
So thank you so much for not sending those.
Yeah.
And we will see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.